Welcome, and thank you for joining us for our panel. This morning we're going to be talking quite a bit about the transition that we all just went through to the new individual producer framework for tires. Earlier this morning you heard a lot from Frank and Charles and Roger and Pat and John about the principles of IPR and how IPR is implemented, including what each stakeholder group needs to know to prepare for IPR. Today's panel is going to focus on some of the key lessons learned regarding the transition of the tire program, previously operated by Ontario Tire Stewardship, to the individual producer responsibility framework operated under the Act and the tires regulation. We hope the information this morning is going to help everybody start to think about their materials and what they need to start to be prepared for, to avoid some of the pitfalls that some of the stakeholders went through, some of the obstacles they had to overcome, some of their challenges, and some of their successes. So we're going to talk a lot about how the framework transitioned. We're going to talk about how the concepts we covered this morning were operationalized, what worked, what didn't, and what a lot of these folks, I think, wish they knew at the start of the process so that they can share it with you. Many market players had a role to play in the transition of the tire framework, in the tire program to an IPR framework. And this is really your chance to hear directly from them to understand how things went. There's a lot of different folks represented on this panel. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction. Each panelist is going to provide a specific lens, whether it be from collectors, haulers, processors, producers, small producers, medium-sized producers, large producers. We've got a little bit of everybody up here who can provide you some context. So why don't we start with a few introductions. We're going to have some time, hopefully, at the end for some questions. We do have some prepared for the panelists. We're going to surprise them a little bit. Some of them are prepared for some of the questions, and some of them are going to be some entertaining ones for them, I hope. So first, we have Gord Day. Gord. Gord is from the Pro Ryse, which is an affiliate with the Emterra Group. Emterra is a tire processor and a hauler. And then we have Andrew Horsman. Andrew's with CRM. CRM is a registered pro, and they're also a tire hauler and processor. We have Steve Meldrum. Steve is from eTracks, the largest pro, and they offer their services to producers by contracting with processors and haulers, much like Emterra and CRM. We also have Adam Moffatt from the Ontario Tire Dealers Association, who represents tire dealers, retailers, and distributors, and can bring us a lot of insights on how these pros or producers work with the collectors and the haulers to deliver the new programs. And then I think everybody knows Pat at this point, who's also joining the panel to provide the authority's perspective on the transition and some feedback to any of the commentary that provides some contextual framework in the IPR context. As I said, hopefully there's going to be a chance for questions near the end. But why don't we start with just a little bit of an introduction from each of the four panelists. Pat, I think we've covered just 1 to 2 minutes briefly about who they are and what they hope to be able to provide to you today. Perhaps we can start with Adam.
Yep, so I'm Adam Moffatt with the Ontario Tire Dealers Association. In a past life, I also ran a few of the tire recycling facilities through Ontario, Liberty Tire Recycling up until 2009, and then I transitioned to the Dealers Association. Our association represents roughly 500 members. Our members are retailers, distributors, wholesalers, and various service providers through the Ontario Tire Network. Our members represent approximately 60% of the new tire sales in Ontario, and we also bring about 60% of the scrap tires back into the marketplace as well.
And so what's the number one thing that you're hoping to be able to convey to the audience today?
I'll just give everybody an impression, an idea of some of the early struggles and the struggles that we have today with our members. I think the collectors as a whole may not have as much care as these guys do. The collectors are kind of the low end of the spectrum. We just want our tires picked up, but share the experience of making sure that happens, and hopefully give everybody a bit of insight into what you can do to help yourselves early on in the process.
Perfect. Gord?
Gordon Day with Ryse Solutions, and again, as Mary said, Ryse is part of the Emterra Group. And one of the businesses that Emterra had for many years was Emterra Tire Recycling. And so when the new regulation came out, we looked at the company and said, is there a way that this new model, this new IPR model with pros, can either hurt or protect that existing infrastructure? And so after some analysis, we decided that it would be better to control some of our own destiny and to establish a pro to support the hauling and processing business that was in place. And so we came into the market with that sort of explicit goal. We knew of eTracks' position in the marketplace, but we were trying to find sort of a niche area and to work with producers directly. And so I think today I want to convey a little bit that, that the market can respond. We responded as service providers to the needs of both the regulation and the producers. And again, I think we've done a fairly decent job, and we're very comfortable where we're at in terms of how it's played out and how we as a service provider was able to respond and ultimately provide producers what this regulation's intended to do is with choice. And choice applies not only to producers, but to the service providers, haulers, and recyclers as well.
Okay. Andrew?
My name's Andrew. I'm in rehab from being the CEO of OTS. The scars run deep, and it still hurts inside. But now I'm the general manager for Canada for CRM. CRM is North America's largest producer of crumb rubber, specifically for the rubber modified asphalt and sports field industries. We have 5 plants in North America, 2 in California, Mesa, Arizona, Albany, New York, and Brantford, Ontario. I'm based out of the Brantford facility, but my responsibilities are a little bit larger than that. And I think the most significant thing that my short 5 months with CRM have been are the degree to which the service provider industry, and I would put ourselves in that category as well, have not yet fully internalized the changes that they need to make in order to respond to this new marketplace, and how the obligations that our customers, be they producers or pros or both, are transmitting obligations down contractually through our agreements, and what changes are needed to be done. As I sit and have conversations with haulers who we work with, or collectors, about that same level of accountability between us and them, as between us and customers like eTracks, you get a real deer in the headlights, because they have real skin in the game, and that change I don't think has yet been fully accepted or adapted to in that market, and it's still ongoing.
All right. Thank you. Steve?
I'm Steve Meldrum. I'm with eTracks. We are solely a producer responsibility organization, a pro. We work with large tire manufacturers, large OEMs, so the automakers, as well as some of the large distributors that are first importers. Those are our customers. We are just a producer responsibility organization. We're not vertically integrated like a number of other players are. We end up having to work with both service providers who we tend to be their biggest customer, but they're also competitors of ours. So it creates an interesting dynamic in the marketplace, to say the least, plus the interpretation of the reg, which we'll get into. We're a not-for-profit that was established about a year and a half ago. I was the first employee, so we've kind of ramped up till now. And really our job is to deliver on our customers' obligations, from their establishing and operating the collection system through to collecting and processing their minimum collection target. And we contract with about 6 processors, 80 to 90 haulers, and we've got thousands and thousands of collection sites in our system.
Perfect. Thank you. And one thing that you're hoping to provide to the audience today?
That we come at it from a different space, in that, like a lot of other material streams that are coming, it's coming towards you. And we on the stage are playing the hand that we're dealt. So we're in a very different position than seeing it coming down. And so we're knee deep in it, and we're having to work through it. And it's not that bad. What an endorsement that is. Yeah, it's just a different framework, and it's about working with folks in the industry and the regulator to try and make it all work.
Interesting. You comment on working with the regulator. So perhaps, Pat, you can provide a little bit of an introduction to how RPRA works with all of the pros up here, the pros who aren't up here today, the collectors, the haulers, the processors, retreaders. We meet with them monthly. We have one-on-ones with them regularly, but can you maybe comment on the importance of the regulator's role in communicating with these folks?
Sure. I think the biggest thing that I would point to with our experience with these folks and other people who are also in the market is the willingness to keep open lines of communication on both sides. I think a large part of the success that we've obtained in getting people registered, particularly getting collectors registered, getting collection system accessibility addressed and all of that, and keeping tires moved, has largely been that everybody's been committed to solving problems all the way along, not trying to hide problems, outing issues as soon as they become issues so we can have a conversation around how to make sure that we're meeting the regulatory objectives. So those open lines of communication have been really, really important for us, and we really hope that those will continue. And we're going to work really, really hard to establish those lines of communication in the batteries world and in the electronics world and MHSW world as well, because it's just so critical for people to be plugged into how things are actually implemented. And I would think that half of the conversations that we had when we met with all of the pros collectively were saying, okay, the reg says this, but what are we going to do to make it work? And I think that was a really critical set of conversations we had through the year.
Perfect. So let's hone in on that a little bit. So there were some obstacles, some challenges that everyone had to sort of work collectively together to try to figure out, to communicate regularly for. Basically, we didn't get to where we are right now easily. So let's talk about some of those obstacles. Gord, can you maybe share with us one challenge that you saw, either as Ryse or through Mterra Group, through the transition, and how you overcame it?
I think one of the challenges, and Pat's, one of the slides he had earlier, he had the distribution of the producer community. And basically about, I think it's like 48 producers represent about 92% of the volume. And Steve is fortunate that a good chunk of those are with his, within his community group, and that's how it's been set up, and that's perfectly fine. I certainly know Ryse and a number of the other smaller pros had to spend a lot of time with the producers, the companies trying to figure this out. And while RPRA did have lots of one-on-ones and continue to have one-on-ones with producers, the tire producer distribution is quite unique, I think, compared to some of the other ones I'm familiar with. And so we were dealing with, in many cases, the husband and wife team that own the distribution center in Listowel, Ontario, have had a reference point with OTS in many cases for many years. And now you're having to explain to them what's different and why the government did this. And so there was a considerable amount of hand-holding, a considerable amount of time, probably more than we anticipated. But we also know that we achieved some of our clients because we spent that time with them. We just didn't say, go figure it out. We often had to point them back to RPRA and the team that they had, and the team that RPRA was developing was learning as they were going as well. And so it was a bit of an iterative process, but that was probably the biggest challenge we found, was just the amount of people out there, the amount of producers out there that had questions, maybe had concerns about dealing with RPRA directly, and wanted someone to tell them sort of the straight goods. And often it was the smaller pros that had to spend the time, and it was a lot of time. But at the end of the day, they were given some communication, some information, and often I think we gained a lot of our clients because we spent the time with them, and a lesson learned.
So communication was key for the process.
It's going to be I think the theme here was you can't do enough. Andrew commented about the service provider community, the haulers. That's a whole different set. From the pro standpoint, from the producers, it was a challenge because of that really pyramid that you have with the producers. It may be different with the other materials as we get into it, but lots of small conversations where you're going right back to the principle of what was in the past, why it's changed, who to complain to, but you had to walk people through that, hold their hands. But at the end of the day, a very high level of acceptance, or compliance, maybe not acceptance, compliance. And so I think us, both eTracks and all the pros, I think spent a lot of time with producers. So I think we helped get the compliance there, but it did take a lot of time.
Adam, can you maybe talk about communication in the context of the service providers? So the collectors, the haulers, how has that been going?
So initially, it was very trying. As Pat alluded to, the collectors, prior to the registration date, there was 15% registered. When we hit the registration date, we had another little blip. But the collectors, they weren't listening. There was a miscommunication somewhere down the lines, and a good portion of the collectors felt that since they had already registered with the OTS, the Tire Stewardship, they were automatically enrolled in the new tire program. So we spent a lot of time educating them on RPRA, who RPRA is and why they had to register with RPRA. That led to our second issue with registration was now we've all registered with RPRA and nobody's picking up my tires. Why? And having to explain to them now, well, now you have an open market and you need to choose one of the pros to work with. We communicated a lot. We piggybacked a lot off of the communications from RPRA, kind of put it into our own language, our language that our members would understand. And it was constant. It was every day on the phone talking with people and just explaining there's 2 steps of registry. That led to our third issue was getting calls that, hey, I've got 5 haulers that showed up at my door today. And it turns out that a lot of the collectors went to the extreme of, we don't really understand the difference between Pro 1, Pro 2, Pro 3. I don't know what a pro is doing for me. I really don't understand this whole concept. I'm going to register with them all. And we had collectors that had registered with 3, 4, 5 pros. So what I would say is I would strongly urge that, especially the service providers, you have the direct communication in the network with the retailers, whether it's an electronics program, whatever the program is. Start educating them very early. Make sure that they understand that they have to register with the authority. Make sure that they understand that the authority is separate from the pro. Make sure that they understand the requirements of the authority are different from the requirements of the pro. Those are very important. The last thing is don't stop communicating. We did a communication blitz. We got good response. And then we had to do another blitz and another blitz. And it was almost as if we weren't directly communicating all the time. We found it very difficult to get the retailers to respond to the registration need. And I think that's directly because in our industry, a lot of the retailers truly are a mom and pop tire shop. It legitimately is a husband and a wife. They've got 1 bay, 2 bays, 3 bays. They don't have time to deal with it. So if you're not continuously reinforcing them and making sure that you're walking them through that process, it's going to be a long and stressful process, I would say.
So not just communication, but constant communication, constant education, continually talking to all of the stakeholders and players about what their role is in the transition. Okay. Steve.
Yeah, no, if I could add to that, this whole year has been a change management issue. That's really what it has. So if you look at it, there's the consumer facing and then there's the industry facing. And from the consumer side, I don't think much has changed. Tires back up a little bit sometimes, but they did that under OTS as well. So from a consumer perspective, I think it's going just fine. From an operating perspective, on the change management side of all the industry players, from collectors, haulers, processors, and pros, and the regulator, is the switch and the pivot from kind of quasi-government run organization where best efforts, you do your best, you get paid for it, kind of pivoting to, no, you've got real business contracts where you have to deliver, and there are terms in this, and that's what Andrew was saying earlier, is within the industry community, it's that hurdle of getting over, oh no, these are real business contracts you have. These are real delivery, and if you don't, there are consequences as a result of that. Whereas before, it was if I decided to haul 10 tires today, I got paid for 10. If I decided to haul 100 tires, I got paid for 100. It was great. It was just kind of a best efforts basis. Mm-hmm. And that single point has been the biggest transition issue on the industry side. I don't think so much on the consumer side, but certainly from the industry.
It's a good point. So it's an exercise in change management, moving something where you had one industry funding organization, OTS, much like we have Ontario Electronic Stewardship or Stewardship Ontario, for electronics, for blue box, for hazardous waste, and moving those materials over into this new world. Mm-hmm. If there was one thing that you could tell folks one thing you wish you knew as you were starting that process, looking at this room, recognizing that we have a lot of folks that are going to be transitioning potentially from blue box, from hazardous waste, batteries, electronics. What would that one thing be? Maybe we can start with Gord.
I think just getting out and understanding who the players are that you may have to be working with, either as a producer or, and again, there's probably some industry representatives here, some associations, just so you can get a taste and a feel for what this is going to be is helpful. Adam's group, at the very beginning, probably the summer before the regulation even came into play, was out there asking the pros to talk about the issues, to present their what they're planning to do. It was as a way of informing their membership, and I think that would be a helpful thing for both individual producers in the audience or industry associations that representing producers, is get the pros in early to ask the questions so that your members can get some real information. You don't want to, and can hear from them directly. So I think that's one of the key things, especially going forward, which is you're giving choice. The whole regulation's about choice. You have to understand what that means. And so I would say from the producer and the pro standpoint, the producer or industry association, get pros in as early as possible to understand and to have those questions. Because producers don't always like to talk amongst themselves. Like they need to establish that one-on-one relationship. At the end of the day, it's a one-on-one relationship. You don't have an industry body that you're going through. So have those direct dialogues. It's very useful.
So Andrew, I imagine you have an interesting perspective on one thing that you wish you knew at the beginning of the process, whether it's through the lens of OTS, CRM, as a pro now. What would that one thing be?
Get your resume ready earlier. You end up, you've done the process. No, I think from the perspective of being at CRM, which is the opposite end of the spectrum, where the system operator and now a finished goods manufacturer, recycle tires to make our finished product, is really the fact that, I think a lot of people liken these industries to an extractive industry, right? Forestry or mining or something. And so you're going to have a quota, you're going to go and get a certain volume, and you're going to, everything's going to work well. I think as Steve said, we are at the receiving end of material coming down. And the whole system is set up to set targets based on a series of assumptions using historical data that then is going to drive actions by processors and haulers and collectors. But that mathematical exercise to come up with a target does not necessarily have any actual bearing to what actually happens in the market. And so translating that necessary exercise of going through target setting and then saying, how do we implement this in the real world, where volumes may be different and distribution may be different, is I think an exercise where the pros and the service providers and the regulator could probably work more constructively earlier, because, and maybe this is a first year issue, I think there is a significant amount of dislocation between what the targets are and what's actually happening out there. And that creates, I think, a lot of angst down through the chain, because we haven't gone through a year where we've got the real results and said, all right, what happens? And I think, Pat has made some very reasonable comments about, if all targets are missed, but everything's gotten dealt with, then that's an okay outcome. But no one's gotten to that point yet. And so I think that creates concern for pros. The pros then hammer on their service providers, and the service providers are saying, well, I'm giving out all she's got, Captain. She's buckling. You're out there trying to bring that stuff in. How do you go through that exercise? And that real world dialogue and that ability to have open dialogue on a two-way basis, with us providing data and RPRA in response providing perhaps quarterly, this is what we are seeing, I think helps sort of truth out what's really going on in the market in a way that no one else can do, because RPRA is the only one with the overall vision of the market.
Pat, do you maybe want to respond to that a little bit? The comments about it being a transition year and targets, what they mean, the performance, and perhaps some of Andrew's later comments about quarterly reporting.
Sure. It's definitely a transition year, and and I can't wait to see what the results are. We have to wait till next year to find that out. For me, from a regulatory perspective, it's really, really important to acknowledge the reality that it is a transition year. So as long as there's a clear indication that people who have obligations in this world are working very constructively to meeting those obligations in this transition year, they're not going to be held to a standard of perfection. I mean, in fact, you can't generally run a regulatory process to a standard of perfection. It's got to work to meet the regulatory objectives in a reasonable way. So I think that's our approach for this transition year. The issue around the targets, absolutely. I mean, targets are set based on a mathematical model. What happens from an economic perspective, year by year, what actually gets sold into the marketplace in a year. That's an important factor, and it's important to acknowledge that there's two things can happen. I mean, the target might be aggressive in a particular year just because of how sales happened in relation to what's happening in the marketplace as opposed to what happened with historical data. So we're certainly prepared to acknowledge that, and everything that gets collected gets processed, and then targets are exceeded. Obviously, that's not a problem. But if everything that's available to be collected gets collected and gets processed, and the aggregate target is still short, well, I don't really see that as a problem either, because the important thing is that everything that's available to be collected is getting collected and processed, and tires are moving the way they should. So that's a critical component of our approach. And I think it's down to just in terms of what's going on in our ability and our line of sight into the marketplace. The third question that was raised by Andrew. Individual pros are reporting into us now on a monthly basis, telling us how they're making progress towards meeting the obligations of their producer clients. So we are paying attention to that, and if we see a trend going in a way that we're not sure we understand, we have a meeting and we talk about it. And right now, it just seems like it's trending the way it should, but the year isn't over yet. It snowed late this year, so people started changing out tires later than usual this year. So that meant that the collection bump that you see in the last quarter started later than usual. So that's a factor. We'll have to take that into account. And it'll have a knock-on effect into next year, and we'll just manage that. We did that transitioning from OTS to the new world. There was a backlog that had developed in the last year before the transition. We worked with Andrew when he was wearing a different hat before he got tread marks on his sole. But we managed that process all the way through, and every year there's going to be a bit of a management process year over year over year, just based on what happened in the course of that year.
Perfect. So Steve, crystal ball, what would be your either comments to this or the one thing you wish you could go back and knew?
So there's two aspects of this. One is on what Pat said and what Andrew recommended. This speaks to the complexity of the relationships in the industry. If RPRA were to, on a quarterly basis or nearing the end of the year, say, you know what, overall, everyone is collectively 90% of the way there. That largely, if it's on a pro rata basis, would largely fall on eTracks. And we have Ryse and CRM that are competitors of ours, that are service providers of ours, that would now know that information, that could then use that and say, okay, so here's a supply-demand issue. If we've got the ability to, because we're service providers of yours, we know you're hurting. We can get out there and start to play games. Those are the complexities. I'm not saying that's happened. I'm not saying it is happening. I'm saying that it has the potential to happen. And that's where vertical integration of competitors becomes quite an issue. So that's just one comment on that. In terms of what, if I could go back, what is it that one change? It would be to better understand. Now, we're the victim of being the first out of the gate. We're the victim of the reg being finalized very late as it relates to when it needed to get implemented. So with all of that as context, it would have been really nice to understand how the regulator would be interpreting things throughout this initial year. As I say, we're a victim of a number of circumstances on this, but when you're a startup and you're having to define your business models, and your business models are based on assumptions based on the regulation that's out there, if there's either inconsistencies or changes or just, hey, it's a transition year, so you know what, game on January 1st next year, all that's fine. It's just knowing that up front, what that is, which may be impossible just because we are the first out of the gate. But that would have been something that would have been just very clear for us to direct the way that we were going to do business this year, instead of having to tweak here and there. Again, transition year, we get it, but that's just the reality.
Pat, do you want to respond to that a little?
No, I think it's very, and I made this point in several different ways through the course of the day. It's really, really important to understand how the regulator is going to implement. And one of the things that, and Steve indicated there was a tight timeline, between the reg getting rolled out and market adaptation and all of that. So we did roll out a number of compliance bulletins, and we added to them as issues started to arise. And so I would say, yes, it's absolutely important to get compliance guidance from the regulator just to make sure. And by the same token, if you have assumptions, test those assumptions with the regulator as well. It's a two-way communication street. We're happy to do all that. That helps us actually understand whether there's issues that exist that we hadn't occurred to us. I mean, we need that information, and we're always happy to develop compliance bulletins that would say, here's how we want to manage this issue from a regulatory perspective, and provide that that guidance. So, what is a producer? How does the collection system actually work? How is the reporting process? What do you actually have to report, and all of that stuff? So yeah, we're absolutely prepared. We need runway to do some of that, and every time the runway is confined, it just makes that harder to happen. But and some of it spills into the actual transition year itself, and we just have to roll with it, as Steve said. Yeah.
So back to this constant communication, not just amongst the service providers, the producers, the pros, but with the regulator as well. Adam, some sage advice to the audience about one thing you, or perhaps maybe from putting on the hat of one of your members, that you think it would have been useful for folks to understand or know right from the get-go.
So to piggyback off Steve's point earlier, it's very important that all of the service providers, your retailers, your your haulers and your processors do understand that in our transition anyways, we were going from essentially I'll pick up what I want to pick up and deliver it where I want to deliver it model to a model that is entirely contracted now. And what we're continuing to urge our members is kind of 3 points. One is don't bite off more than you can chew. Under the OTS model, if you had all the aspiration in the world to pick up 1 million tires a year and you only hit 500,000, not a big deal. In today's world, you're contracting to a pro and you're contracting a volume commitment. And typically those volume commitments are followed by some kind of, I'm sure there'll be some kind of punishment for not hitting those volume commitments. So make sure you recognize and understand that. The second thing is, especially for the large service providers, you're gonna have to come to the realization probably pretty quickly that no singular pro will probably be able to accept all of your volume of your commodity. You are gonna have to work with multiple pros. That is going to create an element of confusion for you, and it's something that I kind of wish I could have looked back on and advised members a little differently. Is the third comment of before you sign a contract with the pro, make sure you understand the requirements of that pro. The requirements of all three of the pros on the table right now are different. Some require reporting on a quarterly basis, an annual basis, a semi-annual basis. The level of reporting is different. The commitment is different. The volume commitments you're making are different. So make sure that before you just sign that contract, you understand, what you're supplying, where you're supplying, and who you're supplying it to. We deal with our members all the time, and that would be the one thing that I would really urge is don't just sign on the dotted line unless you know. Make sure your company values, make sure what you're able to provide in terms of information lines up with what's being requested from you by your pros. Otherwise, that could turn around and kind of bite you in the behind. And I guess the last point, Mary, would be you need to also recognize that what your pro is requiring is not necessarily what RPRA is requiring. The RPRA requirements on the service providers is in terms of compliance and in terms of reporting, I can tell you right now is really different from the requirements of the pros.
Can I
Yeah,
pick up on that? Because that's an important element. I think coming to an operational level. At the end of the day, this is the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act. And so you want to set up a framework that allows that to be done as successfully and efficiently as possible. And I think one of the things I've observed in the transition from OTS, where it had certain obligations that were placed on all of the parties, but notably collectors, who are the originators of the material that is intended to be recovered. Some of those requirements did not survive the transition to the new world. And the reg actually rolled back some of those obligations with regards to material contamination and that sort of thing. And I think this would be true of any material category, the more you can get clean material, the more you're going to be able to recover that resource effectively and efficiently, and that's ultimately the objective. And I think one of the things I know we have seen operationally is, looking at some data, the degree to which there is contamination of material coming in the form of tires, rims would be the biggest possible one, where OTS required derimming. The reg explicitly does not require derimming. So you have a funnel where you have a collector who's got 40, but a processor gets 4,000. And so as a manufacturer with many millions of dollars invested in manufacturing, those contaminants present an existential risk to that operation. If that goes through, you can destroy the ability of that facility to continue to recycle. But I think there is a missed opportunity by not requiring all of the players in that supply chain to have a hand in ensuring that there is high quality recyclable material. And I think some of that may come from the Act, some of that may come from the reg, but I would say that is one thing as you're looking at future materials is there a way to design into those obligations a requirement to, at the input, make sure that material is as recyclable as possible. I think the analog is in the Blue Box program, single source, single box was a long time ago operationally seen as very efficient. That is one of the major reasons why we get crap at the back end of a MRF and it can't go anywhere right now. Same thing with tires. When you have material that comes in, be it rock or metal or rims or that thing, that damages the ability to recycle that material, which I think is contrary to what we're trying to do. And I think the answer is, well, the market will figure it out. Well, yes, it'll figure it out, but there's a cost to figuring it out. We might be able to do it more efficiently and actually achieve the policy objectives better if we thought about it at the front end, at the regulatory design perspective.
Interesting. Steve, do you want to comment on that? The idea of including in the regulation stricter guidance on how materials are to be recovered.
Yeah, I mean, in as much as only broadly do we have a dog in this fight, another way of looking at it would be it's an opportunity for, if you're unable to clean it up as an input, it's an opportunity for service providers to have additional capabilities, and it's a contractual thing. And okay, so now CRM or Mterra or anyone else builds a tire cleaning space, and there's a fee for service for that, and we work on making that more efficient. I mean, there's many ways you can approach this. I understand from a receiving the tires perspective, you want them to be as clean as possible, but if the reg doesn't allow that, then figure out a way to make it happen otherwise. Having said that, I know it's also a pain to deal, and just practically, as stuff gets in there, it's a problem, and there is a cost to doing it.
Fair. So is it in the regulation, or do you allow contractual arrangements to figure this out?
Yeah.
Gord?
And again, speaking sort of on the Mterra tire side, I would echo what Andrew said. The requirement was to pick up the tires that were collected with rims, and there really wasn't that ability to, from a cleanliness standpoint. Our operations team said we're not going to handle stuff from those type of collectors where we've had problems in the past because we don't have that capability to, we don't have the space. So having it a market-driven solution could happen, but from a timing perspective, we just didn't have the time. So I would echo that, especially when you look at the requirements of the other materials that we're now looking at, whether it's batteries, which may have unique handling requirements. Certainly electronics have unique handling requirements. I think there should be some thought to, sort of a viewpoint on exactly what Andrew said about maybe there's some standards that could be put in to say this is how we need to do it so that it makes the system run more efficiently, rather than just sort of saying, okay, over to you. I can't, the other thing is we can't, if we get a painted tire, in our particular case, if we get a painted tire in the system, it can't be diverted. We can't reach the diversion requirements, even though it's bear to cost all the way through the system. And so it's just one of those realities. We don't get that many, but to Andrew's point, the ability to improve the quality, efficient, was probably missed. I think that's probably a fair way of saying it was a missed opportunity.
Interesting. Pat, do you think you can comment on this?
Well, tires and rims, it's an interesting example of contamination because there's value in the rims as well. But what the reg actually requires is that collectors have to accept tires whether they're on rims or not. And that's it. What happens after the tires are collected is in the hands of the people who are selling services to producers directly or through pros or whatever. So there's nothing in the regulation that prevents or is a barrier to putting into place controls that ensure that you don't put a tire on a rim through a grinder. I mean, obviously that's going to break the grinder, and there's no obligation to do that. It's really a collection obligation and then an outcome-based performance requirement, and in between that is the contractual relationships that you establish to make that happen. I know Adam and I have had conversations about this. I know Adam's got a perspective as well. I don't know if you wanted to comment.
I honestly don't know how much more I could add. The challenge with rims in this case is, yeah, they're a commodity, they hold a value. I've always said, you know, the value of a rim is like riding a roller coaster. 1 month you're winning, 1 month you're losing. You can look at the price of metal today, and it's pretty clear that you know, anybody who's collecting tires on rims and trying to recycle them out, you're in a losing proposition. There's not enough value there. You know, through the plants that I formerly run, this was an issue. We did a lot of de-rimming on site. We crushed on site. We just sold the metals and hoped to recoup our value. And I don't know that, you know, you would necessarily write in the regulation who's responsible for the de-rimming of the tire. I've always just looked at it kind of as an operational facet that has to be handled, and whether it's a collector, the hauler, the processor, you know, the pros are going to have to, some way, shape, or form, negotiate to one of the groups to say, your responsibility, this is how you'll be, you know, rewarded for removing the rim, and kind of move on with your day.
Okay. Thank you. So some differing perspectives on rims. So this is an outcomes-based regulation. I sort of want to move on to some broader, higher level subjects. So those outcomes are delivered in the context, though, of a competitive market. We heard that a lot this morning. We heard it from Pat. We heard it from Charles. We heard it from Roger. I want to talk about that a little bit more and want to hear your perspective on the idea of an outcomes-based regulation in the context of a competitive market. Can we maybe start with you, Steve?
In what respect?
So how do you feel about the regulation, an outcomes-based regulation being delivered in the context of a competitive marketplace? Amongst pros, amongst service providers, dealer's choice here is how you want to
Sure. I think it's fine. I think the hurdle, as we said, is that the service providers don't think of it that way. They don't think of it as an outcome-based situation. It's a contractual thing from our perspective. So on that side, I think the competitive landscape is going to play itself out on the service provider side. We now have a year under our belt. People have delivered, not delivered, met their commitments, not met their commitments, and now we know kind of how this went and who we want to work with. So on that competitive side, I think it's shaking out as we speak. I think on the competitions between pros and so forth, I think we've had a fairly good relationship. I think we're all working towards our goals, our outcomes. As I said, there's strange complexities when pros who are competitors are also service providers to us who have to deliver on a contract so that we can meet our outcome. And they also have their outcome that they're working towards. So those are just strange dynamics that are happening that we're trying to work through. But by and large, so far so good.
So far so good. Gord, Andrew, do you have any comments on that?
I think from the pros' perspective, dealing with producers, I do know it has been fairly competitive in terms of us dealing with the producers that have got the obligations. Again, I think Steve's group and membership was pretty well locked in early on due to the good work that they did in advance of the regulation to sort of respond to their members' needs. But we actually, we had a fairly healthy competitive process in the marketplace once producers realized they could actually have some choice, and we encouraged them to talk to the other producers and take advantage of that choice that the regulations provided them. As a producer meeting this outcomes-based, we had to do some planning and thinking about how we're going to deal with the volumes that are coming in, the allocations, and then to prepare. Again, we are vertically integrated, but that doesn't mean we work with probably 6 or 7 other haulers in the marketplace across Ontario. We work with about 4 other processors because we needed to prepare ourselves for the inevitable or the potential of what happens if something goes down at the plant or something like this. So we had to prepare our contingency plans, and so, but that was because it was an outcomes-based model. If we just, maybe under the old model, if we just simply said, well, if it goes down, it flows over there, but we had to take this into consideration because we were actually contracting with producers. We were taking on, not legally, but we were taking on the responsibility of meeting their obligations, and that's certainly how they viewed it. And so, so we had to make sure that as a service offering that we had some balance, that we had some, met all the requirements of the regulation, and could achieve those targets that they had. Because again, to Andrew's point, when the producer goes in and entered their data, they were given a very specific number right down to the kilogram, and that was what they were expecting of the service of the pros to meet. And so, of course, that's what you're trying to do is serve that customer that way. So we had to do some planning and do some contingency planning, but largely I think the model of an outcomes-based approach, as long as it's clear going in, it gives us the time. The other challenge, obviously, is just the runway that Pat talked about. Tires, again, was compressed. We've been dealing with stuff as we've been going along, and some stuff is still in process. That's a bit of a challenge when you're talking to producers. And then now when I see the timelines for the other 2 materials, batteries and waste electronics, I'm getting even more nervous because of that condensed timeline. Ripper's learnings will be condensed because they've been through it once, as of all of us. But there's a lot to get through in for those other waste streams. That's pretty complicated. So it's going to be, the timelines I think might be challenging for everybody. But from an outcomes based of the model, it works. It's just something you have to know going in and be prepared for.
Okay. Andrew, any comments? Outcomes-based regulation in the competitive marketplace?
I don't think in this first year we've actually seen the full extent of what the competition, of what the dual nature of the potential competitor/service provider dynamic may yield as we go forward. I think for a large part, most of the producers look to find a safe harbor, and that safe harbor was where the big guys were, and that logical, and I think that, I've said, I don't think many of those producers are going to be really looking, any of those names who have any real brand reputation that could be impacted by not achieving their target, none of those I think are going to look to move until they at least get through a full cycle. So I think the opportunity for choice and competition is still yet to be realized. Whether in fact the differing, the way the obligations for things like collection are apportioned depending on the type of producer is, i.e., are you just a major brand holder, which drives one because the collection is really where the devil is in the details there, right? So if you're just a brand holder, that drives one set of decision making. If you're a retail producer, that drives a different set of decision making. And so will the competition actually end up being more between those producer classes? And how will that affect the relationship where pro and service provider are competing but also working together? And I think the work between Ryse, in particular between Ryse and eTracks, has been great this year. I think, in fairness, they carry most of the water for a lot of us, and we work very closely with them to try to help out where we can. I think in year 2 and year 3, you'll probably start to see some more interesting changes. There's, a new pro that's just come up that's looking to be a player in the market, and I think you'll see more people looking at that as those producers express some willingness to talk to you about what the options are. I think right now it's been, let me get through this. I don't even really understand what's changed, so I need to get through a full year, and then I'm ready to start looking at my options.
Okay, thank you. So lots of challenges, issues that folks went through, things that you wish you had a crystal ball before. There's a lot of comments out there about how the program's actually operating. Before we move on to questions from the floor, I'm just wondering if you guys can provide some first-hand, on-the-ground perspective. How is it working overall? Maybe we can start with you, Adam?
Well, I would say, you look at the scrap tire network today, and we don't have stockpiles of tires. So you can effectively say that there may be challenges administratively, there may be challenges contractually, but tires, the commodity is moving. It's not piling up at municipal landfill sites, it's not piling up at the retailers. So you know, at a high level, it's functioning. It's doing what it needs to do. It's, you know, you guys get into the administrative stuff now.
So tires are moving.
Yeah.
The programs are, from your perspective on the ground, working beyond some of the administrative challenges that are being experienced. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I would concur. I think there's the perspective of the customer. Again, agree, customer really hasn't changed. Tires are still being often picked up by the same company from the same location as it had previously. There is, to Andrew's point, this transitional process that the service provider, both collectors and haulers, are struggling with. And again, when I say struggling, it is that change that they have to go through. It's a different model, but because the tires are being picked up, it kind of largely means they're working their way through it. Mm-hmm. We haven't had collapses or parts of the province that have just collapsed. Thank God. Again, it's the turn. It's working through the issues. I think on the producer side, where I'm a little bit closer, I think again the compliance levels are high. We're still talking to customers today about their 19 obligation. We're still sending quotes out because some of them are slowly coming in. But again, the numbers from a regulatory standpoint, we're talking about the dribs and drabs in terms of the quantities. But you know, largely, I would say it's been a fairly successful year. At least from our perspective, it's sort of we are where we thought we might want to be, and it did a couple of things for us. It sort of gave us more opportunities to collect tires from across the province. Prior to this, we were very GTA Southwestern on focused. We now pick up tires as Dryden and East and West, and so we have a much broader network. We are handling more tires than the company's ever handled in the past, and we've got a great bunch of producers that, again, as Andrew said, I think went one way to start with, just to kind of do, but I think there's going to be some opportunities to work with them to maybe incorporate some of the rubber that we're actually producing from a crumb into products that they may be able to use, and we're doing that with one of our retail partners. So I would say largely we're feeling pretty good about where we ended up as we approach the end of this first year.
Perfect. Steve, can you comment a little bit on what Gord was saying there around the producers? You talked to large producers, large tire manufacturers, large tire vehicle manufacturers as well. Mm-hmm. What do you think from their perspective? How do you think things are going for them?
I think they're in the business of selling tires and vehicles, and they're not in the business of recycling. Collecting, I think we, as has been said before, they think about it as little as possible, but as much as they have to. And I think we're providing that service. I think a perfect example of this transition from old regime to new regime is exactly what Gord just said. When Gord said, our customers are still being serviced, and he was speaking about the collectors. It's like, who is the customer? Is the customer the producer? Is the customer the people who you're picking the tires up from? Mm-hmm. I would argue that the customer is the producer who's kind of funding this stuff, ultimately the consumer. So we are in the middle of this, and we're getting through it.